Hello and welcome to St Michael's House. This is where we usually start our pilgrimages around the site for people to come and to gather and to walk the story of Coventry Cathedral. So please come with me as we explore this site together. We're going to start by going towards the first Coventry Cathedral on Priory Row. Come with me. As we walk past the old buildings here on Priory Row. These are buildings that escaped the bombing, that survived the Blitz, and sit here now as a memory of all that Coventry used to be. We're coming now to overlook the ruins of the very first Coventry Cathedral. This was built by Lady Godiva and her husband, the Earl of Leofric, towards the end of the 11th century for the people of Coventry and as a priory church. This is the west end of the original Coventry Cathedral. Very little is left now, but it's a reminder that there was a cathedral here on this site for some 400 years before it was destroyed in the years of the Reformation. Priory Row leads from St Michael's House down past the footings of the first Coventry Cathedral, past Holy Trinity, the church built by the Priory for the people of the town, which you can see here, which itself overlooks Broadgate, the main shopping centre here in Coventry, filled with people on this sunny afternoon. And so as we bolt back up Priory Row towards the new cathedral, we're walking through the historic heart of Coventry. You can see the Chapel of Unity there against the new cathedral. But first we're going to go round the back of Holy Trinity into the old cathedral. Looking down towards the interior of St Michael's Cathedral, we can follow the track of those walking from the town towards this old church, built in the 15th century and used for so many years for worship before its consecration as the cathedral of the newly reformed diocese in 1918. And you can see, as you look down through to the old apse of the ruins, perhaps you can just make out the two words, Father, forgive. So we're walking through towards the space of the old cathedral. This is always such an extraordinary moment to stop, to pause, and to be aware of the space that we're walking into. This beautiful space was one of the glories of Coventry, a medieval church, one of the largest medieval churches in the country, with one of the highest towers, second only to Norwich and Salisbury Cathedral in terms of their height. This cathedral church now a space to pause and to reflect, place where people come and spend their time to socialise together, for community, a place to reflect, perhaps more than any of those things, on those things which cause us to tear one another apart. So welcome to the ruins of Coventry Cathedral. The ruins have come to house and offer a home to a number of symbolic statues and symbols over the years, and this is one of the best known. It's the Reconciliation statue, originally titled Reunion by Josefina de Vasconcelos. And Josefina first created this sculpture to symbolize two people who had been separated by war finding each other again, in this beautiful image of reunion or reconciliation, falling into each other's arms. It's a statue that's used very much by our schools team here in the cathedral, where students are encouraged to draw or sometimes to humanly recreate the image of this sculpture. And if you can understand it, people need to actually lean in and trust one another if they're to recreate this sculpture for themselves today. And it's a sculpture which we use very often as a symbol for reaching out to those who might not be able to use the central symbols of our own Christian faith, the cross of nails, but are able to embrace and understand this symbol of our shared humanity. So I sometimes take images of this symbol, of this sculpture, small maquettes, as gifts to those in our friends in other faith traditions, or indeed sometimes with no particular faith tradition at all. So this is one of our key sculptures, and as you may know, this sculpture was presented to us in 1995 by Richard Branson. At the same time, he presented the same sculpture to the Hiroshima Peace Park. And the same image is also found on the site of the former Berlin Wall, outside the Church of Reconciliation there in Berlin, and outside the Parliament buildings in Stormont. So it's a really powerful symbol of all that we stand for here in Coventry. This sculpture by Helmut Heinz from Dresden was the gift of the people of Dresden for our Golden Jubilee in 2012, and it symbolises the corners of the buildings left after the destruction of Dresden. It's called Choir of Survivors because it somehow speaks of the way that the testimony of those people whose lives were lost still call us back to recognise the destructive power that can tear us apart, and indeed invite us to honour their legacy, but also to look ahead to a world in which such destruction no longer takes place. And so I invite you to walk with me through this unusually quiet cathedral this afternoon as we walk towards the heart of the cathedral, the ruined apse, the replica of the charred cross, and the two words placed there by Provost Howard in the wake of the bombing in 1940. This, I suppose, is the heart of the cathedral for many people. The ruined apse, the altar, which was made from stones formed of the rubble of the burnt cathedral. The charred cross formed of two roof beams that came down during that terrible night. And the two words, Father, forgive. On the night of Thursday, the 14th of November, 1940, the air raid sirens went off across Coventry at around about 7 o'clock in the evening, and the all clear was not sounded until 6 o'clock the following morning. Over those terrible 11 hours, some 500 Luftwaffe bombers crisscrossed the city, some flying back to their bases in northern France to reload and then coming back, by which stage it was possible to find their way back to the city by the fires burning in the sky. It was really fire that destroyed the city. First, large bombs were dropped to take out the main routes, the access routes, the water mains, the communications. Then smaller shells to puncture holes in the buildings. And then finally, 35,000 incendiaries, which were designed to drop into the holes created in the top of the buildings and to set the city ablaze. That was Adolf Hitler's intention, to completely destroy the city, to Coventryate the city, as the word became known, a word signifying complete destruction. It's said that some 6 days before the 8th of November, an Allied air raid had caused some disruption to a banquet that he was holding in Munich, and he had ordered a strong and symbolic retaliation. Nobody really knows why Coventry was chosen, and there are conspiracy theories about that, but the truth is that it was an industrial city, and actually there were factories only a few yards behind me, just beyond the walls of the cathedral, so it was a legitimate target. Actually, many of the buildings immediately surrounding us here in St Michael's Church escaped, and on the roof of Holy Trinity next door to us, like us, they had people on the roof that night ready to try and get rid of the falling shells, and they were successful. Not so much for us. So above this building is a large flat roof covered with lead, and Provost Howard and maybe 2 other members of the cathedral were on the roof trying to extinguish the falling incendiaries or to get rid of them one way or another. They were up there until about midnight as the incendiaries fell in ever greater numbers. In the end, their efforts were not successful. And just over to my left, above where the organ was, the fire set into the oak beams underneath the lead roof, and from then really the fate of this building was sealed. Provost Howard grabbed the silver cross and candlesticks from the original altar just behind where I'm standing, and they're now, you can see them in the museum area in the bottom of the cathedral, and he escaped safely. The next morning, November the 15th, he came back into this building to see a scene of devastation. Fallen columns, stones piled higgledy-piggledy. You see, what had happened was, as the flames set into the oak ceiling, the heat of those flames buckled the iron strengthening girders that had been put in by the Victorians. And so those girders pulled in the columns and the whole roof collapsed. And so inside was a blazing inferno. But around that remained standing the walls of the cathedral, which you can still see today. In the city, sometimes we commemorate the Blitz of the 14th of November 1940, but really it should be the 15th of November, because that's where our story started in earnest. How could Provost Howard have responded? With anger, with a call to revenge or retaliation? Somehow he was able to dig deep into his Christian faith, into his relationship with Jesus, and to reach out in words of reconciliation. He had these 2 words, Father, forgive, written on the stone, and they were eventually carved. He didn't say even, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. He said, Father, forgive. All of us need that word of forgiveness, that gift of forgiveness from God. And we can only plead for ourselves and for others. We're not in the position of Christ to be able to reach out from a place of perfection. And so he reached out in reconciliation. And only 6 weeks after the bombing, when the BBC World Service broadcast their Christmas Day service here from the cathedral, with our cathedral choir singing in a little crypt, which I'll show you in a few moments, he said, hard as it may be, we are seeking to banish all thoughts of revenge from our hearts and our minds, and to reach beyond the days of this conflict, to build a kinder, a gentler, a more Christ-child-like sort of world. and that promise and commitment came good in immediately following the war, when first missions of reconciliation went out to Kiel in northern Germany, and then very soon after that to Hamburg, ultimately to Berlin, and eventually to Dresden, as is famously told. So we become symbols of a renewed relationship between these cities which have known such destruction. Shard Cross, the original, which you'll see in a moment in the cathedral, is a symbol of God's presence with us in the midst of destruction, but even more so perhaps the Coventry Cross of Nails, which I wear a form of as the Dean of the Cathedral, as do all my colleagues here. So the original Cross of Nails formed from 3 huge nails which fell from the burning roof timbers, picked up by a local priest, Arthur Wales, and soldered together into a cross and then silver plated, a symbol both of the destruction that we experience as human beings, but also of the hope that God gives us right in the midst of that destruction. And so this place in the heart of our cathedral, in the heart of our city, is a symbol actually of destruction. It's a symbol of honesty, a symbol of the reality of the world as so many of us experience. But the important thing is that the story does not finish here. So come follow me as we make our way through into the new cathedral. And so just before we go through into the new cathedral, I mentioned to you the tower, one of the highest in this country, which just goes up and up and up, almost impossibly high, all the way reaching to the sky. So as we make our way towards the new cathedral, I just wanted to take the opportunity to point out this area here, which is above the crypts, and we had to dig up these flagstones a few years ago, and as we did that, I was able to put my hand down here, and this is exactly where the choir stalls were in the old cathedral, and so probably about a foot or so, half a metre underneath these flagstones are the charred remains of the choir stalls left from that night in 1940. And on my desk at home I've got a little bag of ashes which are drawn from that night. It's a way of connecting accurately with real history of the real destruction that took place here, which then God was able to turn to a message of hope. So do come with me now as we make our way towards the new cathedral, through this great arch that was opened in the old, and as we look down towards the entry to the new cathedral and the great west screen, you can just make out the angels there and the reflection of the ruins behind me. Here's the statue of St. Michael. Triumphing over the devil. A symbol of the power that this cathedral's ministry has. This is another of the classic views of the cathedral. As you can see, the huge porch with the statue of St Michael and the Devil to its right. To the left, the apse of the ruined cathedral and the tower reaching above it. And to the right, the great walls of the new cathedral. And those are the fountains of the university, which is just behind me. Here in the new cathedral, we find a place to share in hope. As we move into the space of the nave, hope begins to dawn upon us. And as we move further back in the cathedral, our prayer is that hope turns to healing and our relationships with God and one another will be restored. And so we've come into the new cathedral, and you can see on this floor that I'm kneeling on these extraordinary brass letters with the words, "To the glory of God, this cathedral burned November 1940, is now rebuilt 1962. They are extraordinary words, and the sense of God's glory being revealed in a destroyed cathedral, now rebuilt, is a profound one that takes us into the heart of our ministry here, the heart of the life of Jesus, the heart of the way that we are called to follow him. And so, making our way through the cathedral, we are moving towards the font, the foot of the extraordinary baptistery window. And that's the next thing for us to pause and look at. The Coventry Cathedral font is one of our absolute glories, and as you can see, it's a boulder cut from the hillside, from the road leading from Bethlehem down to Hebron, and shipped here as a gift of Langs the builders in 1962. It has a scoop hollowed out in the top of it in the shape of a shell, and we use this font for our baptisms on a regular basis, and it connects us with the real history of Jesus. This building is actually all about Jesus, but then this baptistery window behind me just speaks of the glory of God, the Holy Spirit breaking into our world in ways which don't necessarily restrict themselves to the patterns of our own Christian faith, but speak to people in a universal way of the glory of God. The John Piper window, created by Patrick Renshens, was one of the largest stained glass windows in the world when it was invented, and it's still a sight that takes the breath away from our visitors. Let's have a look at it from the other side of the nave as we go towards the Chapel of Unity. So here we are on the other side of the nave, looking across at the font and this extraordinary baptistery window. As you can see, it goes up from these deep reds and greens into the burst of yellow, symbolizing the glory of God, reaching up into the deep blues towards the ceiling. The most extraordinary sight. And so from the view towards the baptistery window, we can see as we move across the main nave of the cathedral past those tablets of the word on the wall with text from scripture, the slender columns sitting on their tiny pins, a glimpse of the tapestry in the distance. But coming round past this thorn flower sculpture made in memory of those children who died in the concentration camps, heading past a view out towards St Michael's House where we started this tour, and then moving towards the Chapel of Unity. Walking towards the Chapel of Unity, you can just see this glimpse of this special place. Part of the cathedral building, but actually technically not part of the cathedral. This chapel is dedicated to the uniting of God's people in the church, set aside at the creation of the cathedral or specified as part of our design as a place for the shared prayer, as was said, for people of different faiths. That meant at the time people from different Christian churches. Now we sometimes think of this as a place for people from many different faith traditions to meet. And it's an extraordinary space which our architect described as being like a crusader tent, not an illustration which we would want to talk about so much these days. As you look at this space, here behind me are the peace cranes which we use at the annual commemoration of the destruction of Hiroshima, Sadako's peace cranes. That's one of the most significant events that takes place here in this chapel. But it's also used as a place to gather people together. I'm not able to show you right today the illustration we use with our golf balls, where we drop small balls around the outside of the chapel and discover that they trickle their way through the chairs that are usually in here, except for the time of the coronavirus, and gather under the altar here in the middle of this mosaic floor, the gift of the people of Sweden, designed by the artist Einar Forsyth, and which has symbols of the different continents of the world alongside symbols of the different evangelists. So it's an extraordinary and special space, a place for gathering, a place for sharing, a place for committing to the unity of God's people in the church and in other faiths. And so here we are back in the centre of the nave, in front of the Cairo, the symbol of Christ in our midst, around which we gather for prayer in the morning and again at midday. And if you'd just like to follow with me, we're going to walk up through the cathedral towards the high altar. And as we go, we walk past what can appear grey walls, through the spaced chairs for our present social distancing time of worship. And we're being drawn into the reality of all that God has to share with us. As we go, just to look briefly to our left and to our right, you can see these tablets of the word, which have scriptures chosen by the cathedral to communicate the heart of the Christian faith. A new commandment, this one says, I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. Here is the pulpit and the great lectern with the eagle lectern designed by Elizabeth Frink, and another of our tablets here. Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your soul. And so, coming back through our choir stalls with these extraordinary, these flights of doves ascending above the choir stalls, we move up towards our high altar. Our visitors very often have to do what I need to do now, which is just to jump the rope. We're looking a little bit empty at the moment because of the impact of coronavirus, but we're moving up towards the high altar. In the distance you probably hear some of the work going on in the cathedral for our new hospitality area. Toilets, it has to be said, but also an education suite to reach out in our ministry towards younger people. And so here we are, just approaching the high altar. These 6 great candlesticks on either side, designed by Hans Koper. But then in the center of the altar, the high altar cross, designed by Geoffrey Clark, and at its heart, one of the original crosses of nails. Please ignore the drilling going on behind me. So there in the heart of our high altar cross, one of the original crosses of nails from the burnt roof of the old cathedral, now at the center point of our worship here in the new cathedral, and the high altar cross reaching out to the world in the ministry of reconciliation. Behind the altar cross, of course, you can see the feet of Jesus. And as you look up to the great tapestry, the figure of Christ surrounded by the 4 evangelists, looking out upon us. I wonder what you see in his gaze. A steady gaze that sees all, looks on with love and with hope. And then, if we just move slightly to the side, you can see this human figure stood between Christ's feet, almost unaware of the figure of Jesus behind him, but sheltered nevertheless, looking out at the same sight that Jesus sees and praying that he might share Jesus' perspective. But one of the glories of this cathedral is the way that we've walked past almost blank walls, and we may have been unaware of the glories that await us. So as people come here to the altar to receive communion, then we invite them to turn, ready to return to the main cathedral, to their places. And as they turn, they see to their left and to their right these extraordinary windows. What was a rather dark and forbidding space has become flooded with light. We sometimes call the cathedral space itself Journey into the Light. This then is the place of healing. We've traveled from honesty through hope into healing here in Coventry Cathedral. I know it's not quite the same as actually being here, but I hope that you've managed to capture some of the flavour of what this cathedral is like to journey through. Before I leave you, I'm going to show you just 1 or 2 of the additional chapels that we have. We are having some new building work done on the cathedral at the moment, which is very exciting, but it does mean that some of the areas are not as open or quite as presented as they normally would be. But come with me as we look at the area just behind the high altar. I'm standing now just by the foot of the steps coming down from the chancel, and you can see here this amazing sculpture, the Plumb Line and the City, which was given to us in 1972. And we've used this sculpture for the title of our arts festival in 2018, which we called the Plumb Line, because it's a way that God calls us back to our true values as a city, to orient ourselves towards him and therefore to one another. Let's have a look at it a little bit more closely. And so you can see just next to it an image of this sculpture created by the icon, one of our icons, our International Cross of Nails schools. This one from our icon school in Guntramsdorf in Austria. So now we're going to move up towards the Chapel of Christ in Gethsemane. This is a chapel which was designed as a place for quiet prayer by Basil Spence, and it's where we reserve the Holy Sacrament. You can see this metal screen surrounding the chapel, created for the cathedral by the Royal Engineers, and a symbol, of course, of the crown of thorns. And then just looking into the chapel itself, you can see the angel offering the cup, the chalice of choice, to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. To the right of the angel is a sculpture of the disciples asleep. And as you can see, the place where the sacrament is reserved. This is a special place, a quiet place, an intimate place. It's where we keep the Maundy watch. And it's a place from which we often lead our services of morning and evening prayer and Holy Communion. And so turning right from the Chapel of Christ in Gethsemane, we move towards the Chapel of Christ the Servant. I did mention that we've got some renovation work going on at the moment, so forgive the ladder, but let's go and have a look in here. So walking up the steps into this chapel is actually, in a way, to walk out into a balcony onto the world. The wording as we walk into the chapel, as you can see, if your Lord and Master has washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. And so this chapel has clear glass in it, a window out onto the world. Today, what you can see through this glass is our university buildings. When the cathedral was built, it used to look out over factories. But today, the university is such an important part of our social and economic life in this city. And so you can see in the heart of the chapel this altar, created by the apprentices of Coventry, a place for us to come and offer our prayers for the world around us. It's the place where we quite often put prayer stations, for example, around the departure of Great Britain from the European Union, something which causes us great sadness and anxiety here in the cathedral. It's also a place that we sometimes use for our art exhibitions, and as we put images, often portraits, around the walls of the chapel, it creates a different sense of community here. And so just coming back to almost our final pause point, the Lady Chapel at the foot of the great tapestry. We're using the Lady Chapel at the moment for our temporary song school, but we'll have a quick look in it, and then we can see this sense of, again, another special place for us to gather and pause. It's the place that we often use actually for our morning prayer services for our pilgrims coming, as we hope that you will one day. And so we walk through into the chapel. So here in the Lady Chapel, as we gather for worship around a place at the moment being used as the song school, we gather at the foot of the tapestry and the image of Christ crucified. And these rather extraordinary swirls to his left and his right are actually traditional images of the moon and the sun covering their faces at this great tragedy that's taken place. So once again, we're drawn back to the heart of our faith, and if we just look up for a moment, you'll be able to see up to that image of the feet of the human figure between the feet of Christ, and then up and up and up. To the tapestry above us. I come down here to the chapel of the Stalingrad Madonna, the Millennium Chapel, and as you'll gather, there's a lot going on around us in the cathedral at the moment, so apologies for all the noises that you can hear in the background. But just before we finish our tour with the charged cross, I did want to just show you this, if the sound will allow us to. This extraordinary image, beautiful image of a mother and child in the Russian style is a facsimile of an original which is in our sister church, the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church in the heart of Berlin, a church which was similarly destroyed in the air raids of the Second World War, and which has preserved some of that ruined church, but also built an extraordinary new church in a modernist style, consecrated just a year before we were in the cathedral, and a really significant partner with us in the ministry of reconciliation. But this image, the Stalingrad Madonna, was created by Kurt Reuber, a medic, part of the Nazi forces, who had first laid siege to the city of Stalingrad in Russia in 1942, and then when the tide turned in that terrible battle in which some 2 million lives were lost, found themselves besieged. And at Christmas, Reuber created this image as an object of devotion. And the image was saved, it was drawn on the back of the mat. Reuber himself sadly lost his life in one of the camps, a prisoner of war camp. But alongside the image you can see the date 1942, Christmas in the Cauldron is the words on the left-hand side. That's what they called the experience of being in that besieged city. Fortress Stalingrad, and light, life and love. It's an image of the way that, again, in the midst of our darkest place, we can find the presence of Christ, and it's a precious and holy symbol for us here in the cathedral. The last thing I wanted to show you today is the charred cross, and here we're right next to where the building work is going on, so apologies that it's a little bit dark, but this is the original cross made from the fallen roof beams from the Blitz in 1940. Jock Forbes, the cathedral stonemason, had climbed the tower to survey the damage, and he noticed that in the midst of the rubble was a cross made of fallen roof beams, and that image went out across the world. I think it was published in one of our newspapers, the Daily Mirror, and then picked up by newspapers across the world. It became such a powerful symbol of the destruction, the wanton waste that was experienced by the people of Coventry on that night in November 1940. And then Provost Howard had a cross made of the fallen roof beams put up originally behind the altar where we almost started this tour in the ruins. And then a few years later it was brought in here for safekeeping because it's such a precious symbol for us. We have a replica out in the ruins. It's a beautiful thing which sometimes I come and touch as I'm walking up and down the stairs on the way to take services. A symbol of all that we lost but all that we gained, as we embrace the pain, the suffering that we may have encountered ourselves, or that we touch in the lives of other people. That's so often the place where we are touched by the life of Jesus and find his love and his hope, which we have for the sake of the world. It's an extraordinary thing. And so here we have the Coventry Child Cross, a place for us to complete our tour.